The dragon hatchling was found on a Tuesday, which Dr. Elias Vorn had always considered the most forgettable day of the week. Tuesday had no grandeur to it. It was not Monday, which at least carried the dignity of a fresh beginning, however unwelcome. It was not Wednesday, the fulcrum of the week, the day that let a man know he had survived half of whatever was coming. It was not Friday with its perfume of promised rest. Tuesday was simply Tuesday, a gray, obligatory step in a staircase that felt longer every year. In 31 years of practicing medicine in the Ashfin Valley, Elias had delivered most of his worst news on Tuesdays. He had lost his first patient on a Tuesday. He had buried his wife on a Tuesday in November, 8 years ago, under a sky the color of old pewter, while the Ashfin woods stood dark and indifferent on the horizon. He had come to regard Tuesdays with a quiet, private suspicion, the way a man regards a stray dog that has bitten him once, not with hatred, but with the sober knowledge that it could happen again. This particular Tuesday began unremarkably. He woke at 5 before the light and lay still for a moment in the particular silence of a house that had once held 2 people and now held 1. He had learned not to linger in that silence. He rose, built the fire in the kitchen hearth, put water on to boil, and stood at the window watching the Ashfin Valley emerge slowly from the dark, the way a photograph develops in a chemical bath, shapes first, then depth, then detail. The fields to the east were silver with frost. The road through the village was empty. The woods at the valley's edge were a solid black mass against a sky just beginning to concede to morning. He drank his tea standing up. He had always drunk his tea standing up when Margaret was alive because she had loved the kitchen chair by the window and he had loved watching her sit in it. He still could not bring himself to sit there. It had been 8 years. He suspected it might be 80 and the feeling would be the same. By 7 he was in the clinic, which occupied the ground floor of his house, 3 rooms converted from what had once been a parlor, a dining room, and a larder. The walls were whitewashed plaster. The floors were scrubbed flagstone. The shelves along the eastern wall held his instruments and medicines in a strict order that he maintained with the devotion of a monk tending a reliquary. Everything had its place. Everything was clean. In a valley where the nearest hospital was 4 hours by cart over roads that turned to mud every spring, cleanliness and order were not aesthetics, they were ethics. His first patient that morning was a farmer named Aldrich Hess, 62 years old, who came in complaining about his knee. It was the same knee he had been complaining about for 6 years, and the diagnosis had not changed. The cartilage was gone, worn down by decades of labor, and the joint was inflamed. Elias wrapped it, told Aldrich to rest it, knowing Aldrich would not rest it, and prescribed a willowbark tincture for the swelling. They spoke for a while about the coming harvest, about the dry summer and what it would mean for the root crops, about Aldrich's youngest daughter who had married a man from the coast and now lived somewhere Aldrich could not quite picture. When Aldrich left, he walked with the same determined, grinding limp he had always walked with, and he waved without looking back, and Elias watched him go with the particular fondness a doctor develops for a patient who refuses, stubbornly and completely, to be diminished by his suffering. The rain came around middays. It came the way Ashfin Valley rains always came in autumn, not gradually, not with the theatrical buildup of distant thunder and shifting winds, but simply and immediately, as though a decision had been made somewhere overhead and implemented without appeal. One moment the air was cold and dry. The next, the road outside the clinic window was dark with wet and the eaves were running hard. Elias lit an extra lamp and settled into the record-keeping that he had been avoiding since Monday. He was halfway through his notes on Aldrich's knee when he heard the sound from the road. He heard it because he was the kind of man who listened. 31 years of practice had taught him that the body communicates before the patient does, that a cough in the waiting area tells you something before the patient sits down, that the way a person moves through a doorway tells you something before they speak. He had extended this habit to the world outside the clinic as well. He listened to the valley the way some men listen to music, with attention and without agenda, and so he heard what the rain half covered but did not entirely conceal. It was a rhythmic sound, 3 beats then a drag, 3 beats then a drag, not a human gait. The rhythm was wrong, too fast and too light for a person, and there was something in the drag that set his teeth on edge in a way he could not immediately name. He put down his pen and went to the window. For a moment he saw nothing but the rain and the empty road. Then the shape resolved itself from the gray. It came around the bend in the road that curved down from the direction of the Ashfin woods, and even through the rain and the poor light, Elias' first impression was that it was moving with a kind of desperate deliberateness. The movement of a creature that was in significant pain but had committed absolutely to a direction and was refusing to allow the pain to change its mind. It came on 3 limbs. The fourth, the right foreleg, he could see now, was held awkwardly, and behind it dragged something that it took Elias another moment to identify. A wing folded wrong, dragging in the mud. He stood at the window for approximately 3 seconds. Then he was at the clinic door. The creature was perhaps 15 feet away when he opened the door and stepped out into the rain, and the sight of it up close was something his mind needed a moment to fully process, the way the eye needs a moment to adjust from lamplight to dark. It was a dragon. Not in the sense of legend or illuminated manuscript, not the vast fire-breathing monuments of terror that appeared in old books, but a dragon hatchling, young enough that its scales had not yet hardened to full opacity, young enough that there was still something awkward and unfinished about its proportions, too much head and neck relative to its body, its limbs still growing into themselves. It was the size of a large dog, perhaps a little bigger. Its scales were a deep iridescent green that shifted toward blue and black at the edges, like the underside of a beetle's wing. Where the scales had not yet fully set, the skin beneath showed through in patches, pale, translucent, threaded with dark veins. Its right wing was destroyed. That was the clinical word that arrived in Elias' mind before sentiment could complicate things. The membrane, leathery, thin, designed to catch and hold air, was torn along its leading edge in at least 2 places, the tiers ragged and dirty with mud. The primary joint, the one that corresponded roughly to an elbow, was swollen to nearly twice its natural size, and even from several feet away he could see the unnatural angle that meant fracture. The creature was moving on the other 3 limbs and 1 partially folded wing, dragging the damaged wing through the mud of the road, because there was apparently no configuration of its body that allowed it to hold the wing clear of the ground. The people on the road had noticed it by now. A woman pulling a cart stopped and stared. 2 men on horseback pulled their animals to the far side of the road and watched with expressions that ranged from alarm to disgust. A boy of perhaps 10 stood at the roadside with wide eyes and an open mouth. As Elias watched, an older man, he recognized him, Barrett Home, a tanner who had strong opinions about most things, bent and picked up a stone. The stone struck the hatchling's snout with a flat, hard sound. The creature flinched. Its whole body jerked sideways, and for a moment it lost its footing in the mud and went down on one knee, and the involuntary sound it made, a short, sharp, high note, halfway between a whistle and a cry, hit Elias somewhere in the chest with an impact disproportionate to its volume. It was the sound of something very young being hurt by something very old and stupid. He had heard versions of that sound many times. It never stopped being difficult to hear. The hatchling recovered its footing. It looked at Barrett Home for a moment with those amber eyes, wide, bright, extraordinarily intelligent eyes that held in them a quality Elias could not immediately name but which he would later describe to himself as prior knowledge. The look of a creature that had already understood something about the world and was watching that understanding confirmed, and then it turned away from him. It turned toward the clinic, toward Elias. It kept moving. Barrett Home had picked up another stone. "Put it down, Barrett," Elias said. He said it in the same tone he used when a patient was doing something inadvisable, quiet, not unkind, but not requesting. He used that tone because it worked, and it worked now. Barrett Home looked at him, looked at the stone in his hand, and put it down with the particular expression of a man who has decided that someone else's business is, after all, someone else's business. The hatchling reached Elias and stopped. They regarded each other. The rain fell between them and around them and on them both impartially. The hatchling's breath came in quick, shallow rhythms, the breathing of pain managed rather than pain absent. Its nostrils flared. It was smelling him, he realized, reading him in whatever way its senses allowed. He stood still and let it, the way he stood still in the presence of any creature that needed to establish that he was not a threat, which was most creatures and many people. The amber eyes moved from his face to his hands. They were empty hands. A doctor's hands scarred at the knuckle where a patient's involuntary movement had once put a scalpel into him, rough at the palm from years of work, but precise in their shape, in the way they held themselves. The hatchling looked at his hands for a long time. Then it took another step toward the clinic door. "All right," Elias said quietly, mostly to himself. "All right, let me see." Getting the hatchling into the clinic took patience and ingenuity in roughly equal measure. The doorway was wide enough. Elias had widened it years ago to accommodate patients on stretchers, but the creature's instincts worked against its intentions. Every time Elias moved toward it to guide it, it flinched away. Every time he reached for the damaged wing to assess the injury, the pain response made it shy back, knocking into the doorframe, causing itself more distress. It was not aggression. He was clear on that because he had seen animal aggression many times and knew its grammar, the lowered head, the fixed gaze, the particular stillness that preceded movement. This was not that. This was fear doing battle with determination, and determination was winning, but the battle was costly. He stepped back, he gave it room. He sat down on the flagstone floor of the clinic's entrance room, a thing he had never done before in 31 years for any patient, and waited. He waited for 11 minutes, which he knew because he could see the clock on the wall from where he sat, and he had nothing to do but watch it and watch the hatchling and listen to the rain. The hatchling watched him sit. It watched him remain still. It processed this information with those amber eyes for several minutes, and then it walked through the door. It went to the corner of the room, the corner farthest from the door. The corner with the most walls on either side, and it settled there, turning itself so its back was protected, and it looked at him. Ilya stood up slowly and moved to his instrument shelf. He gathered what he needed: saline solution, his finest suturing thread, a set of bone-setting instruments that he had designed himself over years and which he was privately proud of, lightweight cane from the supply he kept for splints, clean linen bandaging, a basin, clean water. He arranged everything on a low table and pulled the table close to the corner, moving it inch by inch, letting the hatchling see each movement before he made the next. He talked as he worked. He always talked to patients when he was doing something that frightened them, not about what he was doing, which tended to make things worse, but about anything else. The weather, the valley, the harvest, the way the frost had come early this year and what it meant for the root crops. He talked about Aldrich Hess and his knee and his stubbornness. He talked about the time he had removed a fishhook from a man's eyelid without the man losing the eye, which had been a Tuesday as well, now that he thought about it, and perhaps that was the thing about Tuesdays. Perhaps they were not bad days after all, only days in which things happened that mattered. The hatchling watched him talk, its breathing gradually slowed. The examination took 30 minutes. The damage was worse than his initial assessment. The membrane tears he had seen from the road were the most visible injuries but not the most serious. The joint fracture was compound, 2 breaks in the hollow flight bone, one of them slightly displaced, which would need to be set before it could be splinted. The membrane itself, once he cleaned the mud away with saline and examined it in good lamplight, showed not 2 tears but 4, the smaller 2 partially hidden by the fold of the wing. There was also bruising along the dorsal surface that suggested the wing had been struck or had struck something with significant force. A fall, possibly, or something in the woods. He did not ask, he set to work. The bone setting was the worst of it. He had no sedatives appropriate for a creature whose physiology he could not fully predict. He had no assistant. He had trained himself over the years to work alone, because in the Ashfin Valley in an emergency, alone was frequently what a doctor was. He explained this limitation to the hatchling not because he expected it to understand, but because he believed in honesty with patients as a matter of principle, and also because talking steadied his own hands. "This is going to hurt," he said. "I'm sorry, I'm going to be as quick as I can." He set the displaced fracture in one movement, which was the only way to set it, and the hatchling's reaction was to grip his coat with its foreclaw and make a sound so low and sustained that Elias felt it in the bones of his jaw. It did not strike him. It did not flee. It held his coat and endured, and he finished as quickly as he had promised. And when he looked up from the wing, he found the amber eyes fixed on him with an expression so complicated and so clear that he had to look away for a moment to compose himself. The suturing took another hour. He worked in silence for most of it, leaning close to the lamplight, placing each stitch with the precision of a man who knew that membrane tissue did not forgive sloppiness. The hatchling remained still. It was a better patient than most people he had treated, which he noted without particular surprise. Animals were generally better patients when they had decided to trust you. The decision was harder for them than for people, and the commitment once made was more complete. The splint he built from cane and linen, light and strong, shaped to the natural contour of the wing so the bones could heal in their correct position. He wrapped the whole wing in clean bandaging, firm but not tight enough to protect, loose enough to allow the circulation that healing required. He checked his work from 3 angles. He was satisfied. He sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. The hatchling looked at the wing, then it looked at him. Then it put its head down on the floor with a long, slow exhalation and closed its eyes. Elias washed his hands in the basin, the water going red and then pink and then clear. He dried them. He looked at the creature in the corner, now asleep with its chin on the flagstone and its splinted wing held carefully off the floor, supported by a folded blanket he had positioned without waking it. His neighbor had left smoked venison on the clinic step that morning, Aldrich Hess's wife, who sent food regularly and without comment, as though she were engaged in a quiet, indefinite argument against his solitude. Elias retrieved the package from the cold box and set it on the floor near the hatchling's head. He had no idea whether smoked venison was appropriate nutrition for a dragon hatchling. He knew that protein was necessary for tissue repair and that a creature its size in this condition needed to eat. It was the best he could offer. When it woke an hour later, the venison was gone in approximately 4 seconds. He brought more, it ate that too. He sat in his chair across the room and watched it eat, and when it was finished, it lifted its head and regarded him with those amber eyes that were, he had decided, the most intelligent eyes he had seen in 31 years of looking at eyes, and he thought about what it had done. It had come out of the Ashfin woods on a broken wing in the rain. It had navigated a road full of people who feared it and at least one who threw stones. It had found the clinic, had chosen the clinic, he was fairly certain, because nothing in the creature's behavior suggested accident or desperation or randomness. It had found a doctor. He did not know how it had known. He suspected he would never know. There were things in the Ashfin Valley that were old in ways that precluded explanation, and the woods at the edge of the valley were the oldest of those things. And perhaps what lived in those woods had knowledge that accumulated in different ways than human knowledge did. "Your mother is going to come looking for you," he said. His voice was quiet in the lamplit room, the rain still falling outside, the early dark of autumn coming down over the valley. "I hope she understands what she sees." The hatchling tilted its head at him. The gesture was precise and considered, not the random movement of an animal but the deliberate repositioning of a mind trying to take in information from a different angle. It regarded him for a moment longer. Then it lowered its head and it closed its eyes and it slept. Elias covered it with a horse blanket, the heaviest one which he pulled from the supply cabinet in the back room, the one Margaret had bought at the autumn market the year before she became ill. It smelled like cedar and old wool. He settled it carefully over the sleeping creature, tucking it against the draft from the window, and then he stood and looked at the room, at the basin of red water, at the instruments on the table, at the small, iridescent shape in the corner breathing slowly in the lamplight. And he felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than happiness and more durable. The feeling of a thing rightly done, which was not always the same as an easy thing or a safe thing or a thing that made sense when you tried to explain it to someone else. He turned down the lamp, he went to bed. Outside, the Ashfin woods stood dark and enormous at the edge of the valley, and somewhere inside them, something very large was already moving. The second day was quieter than Elias expected, and louder than he was prepared for. Quiet in the external sense, the rain had moved on overnight, leaving behind it the particular clarity that autumn mornings sometimes produced in the Ashfin Valley, a sharpness in the air like cold glass, the field standing in pale gold and the sky in almost aggressive blue, the kind of blue that seemed to be making a point. Loud in the internal sense, which was the only sense that had ever really troubled him. His mind, which was a disciplined and orderly instrument by long practice and necessity, kept returning to the corner of his clinic, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because he wanted it to, but because the thing in the corner was simply and completely unlike anything he had encountered before, and his mind was not yet sure what to do with that. He had treated unusual cases. In 31 years in the Ashfin Valley, unusual had become something of a professional specialization. He had treated a man who had been struck by lightning and survived, his skin mapped with fern-like burn patterns that spread from his left shoulder to his hip like a grotesque botanical illustration. He had treated a woman who had gone into labor 6 weeks early during a blizzard that made the roads impassable, delivering twins on a kitchen table by lamplight with a midwife who had never seen a twin birth before and a husband who fainted twice. He had removed objects from people that he still did not entirely understand how the objects had come to be where they were. He had on 2 occasions sat with patients through the night and watched them die despite everything he could do, and he had learned to carry those deaths without being destroyed by them, which was its own kind of unusual. But a dragon hatchling asleep in his clinic under a horse blanket was a different category of unusual, and his mind knew it, and was adjusting to it with the careful, incremental process by which a mind adjusts to anything genuinely new, not all at once, but in layers, each layer revealing the next. He checked on it before he made his tea. It was awake when he opened the clinic door, those amber eyes already fixed on the doorway with a watchfulness that suggested it had been awake for some time. The wing was positioned exactly as he had left it, held carefully off the floor, supported by the folded blanket. It had not disturbed the dressing. He was not entirely surprised. The intelligence in those eyes was not the intelligence of an animal that chewed its own bandaging. "Good morning," he said, because there was no reason not to. The hatchling watched him approach. It allowed him to check the dressing, stood still for the inspection with what he could only describe as professional patience, the patience of a patient who understood what was being done and why. The wound sites were clean. The splint was holding well. The swelling in the joint had reduced slightly, which was more than he had dared hope for overnight. "You're doing well," he told it, and was aware of how ordinary those words felt in his mouth, the same words he said to human patients and how completely appropriate they were. He refilled its water bowl. He retrieved the last of the venison from the cold box and set it down. The venison disappeared. He went and made his tea and stood at the kitchen window, and the Ashfin woods stood dark at the valley's edge against the bright autumn sky, and he thought about what was in those woods. He saw 3 patients that day, all of whom he directed to the front entrance rather than through the clinic, a small deception of logistics that required him to do his examinations in the kitchen, which was cramped and impractical but preferable to the alternative, which was explaining to Merritt Falson, 68 years old and the most efficient transmitter of information in the entire valley, that there was a dragon hatchling in his clinic. He was not ready for that conversation. He was not sure he would ever be ready for that conversation. though he recognized it was probably unavoidable in the medium term. Merit came about a persistent cough, which was the same persistent cough she had been coming about since spring. He listened to her lungs, prescribed the same preparation of thyme and honey that he had been prescribing all along, and answered her questions about his health. She always asked about his health because she had known him since he was a young doctor new to the valley and felt a proprietary interest in his continued functioning, with the same gentle deflections he always used. When she left, he listened to her footsteps recede down the path and then stood still for a moment, waiting to hear whether they paused, whether curiosity would bring her around the side of the house toward the clinic entrance. They did not pause. He released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. By afternoon, he had established a routine, the way he always established routines when circumstances made them necessary, because routine was the architecture inside which difficult things became manageable. He checked the hatchling every hour. He cleaned and re-examined the wound sites at midday. The membrane tears were holding well, which was somewhat miraculous given how ragged they had been, and he allowed himself a small, private satisfaction at the quality of the suture work. The hatchling ate whatever he brought. It drank steadily. It slept in intervals, and when it was awake it watched him with those amber eyes that catalogued everything they touched. Late in the afternoon, when the light was going gold and long through the clinic window, he brought in his chair and sat with it. He brought a book, one of his medical texts, a dense volume on bone healing that he had read many times but always found something new in, and read it in the chair 3 feet from the hatchling, and the hatchling watched him read. And after a while it put its head down and slept again, and the quality of that sleep was different from the earlier sleeping, less guarded, more complete. He noted it the way he noted everything, without ceremony, without making too much of it, but precisely, filed away in the careful record of attention that was the only real instrument a doctor had. It trusted him more than it had that morning. The increment was small, but it was real. He read until the light failed and then lit the lamp, and the clinic was warm and quiet, and outside the Ashvin Valley settled into its nighttime self, and he thought, she will come tonight or tomorrow night or the night after. He did not know how he knew this. He simply did. He was wrong only about which night. The second night passed without incident. He slept lightly, the way he had slept for 8 years, not the shallow sleep of anxiety, but the calibrated half-alertness of a man who had trained himself to be available to emergencies, a doctor's sleep, one layer below full consciousness. He heard the hatchling shift in the clinic. He heard the night birds in the valley. He heard the wind come up around midnight and move through the fields with a sound like breathing. He did not hear anything else. In the morning he checked the dressing and found that the swelling had continued to reduce. The displacement fracture was holding in position. He changed the linen wrapping, unwinding it carefully and reapplying it with fresh bandaging, and the hatchling remained still throughout with that same patient endurance, its eyes watching his hands with an attention so focused it felt almost collaborative, as though it were trying to understand what he was doing, not merely tolerating it. He found himself narrating more, explaining the steps as he performed them. This is the suture on the leading edge, the largest tier, it's holding cleanly, which means the membrane is taking to the repair. This is the joint, I can feel the alignment here, you see, with 2 fingers, the position is good. He spoke to it the way he had sometimes spoken to Margaret when he was working through a problem. Not because she was a doctor, she had been a school teacher with no particular interest in medicine, but because articulating things out loud had always clarified them for him, and because the habit of speaking into a room that listened had become, over the years, something he needed. The hatchling's ear, a narrow, membranous structure on either side of its head that lay flat when it was calm, would angle forward when he spoke. Not every time, but often enough that he stopped pretending not to notice. The second day passed much as the first. More patience, more redirecting to the kitchen, more routines observed with the care of a man who understood that routines were not limitations but load-bearing structures. He ate dinner, soup, bread, cheese, the kind of meal he made automatically these days without thought or interest, at the kitchen table while the first stars appeared over the valley, and then he went back to the clinic and sat with the hatchling in the lamplight and read until it was late enough to sleep. Before he left, he said, "She'll come tomorrow, I think." The hatchling lifted its head and looked at him. "I want you to understand," he said, choosing his words as carefully as he chose a suture, "that however she comes, however large she is and however frightening, I intend to stand in the doorway and let her see me. I think that matters. I think it needs to be clear that I'm not hiding anything." He paused. "I don't know if you understand me. I think you might understand more than I can verify, but I wanted to say it out loud." The amber eyes regarded him steadily. He turned down the lamp and went to bed. She came on the 3rd night. He knew it before he was fully awake, the way certain knowledge arrives, not through a single sense but through all of them simultaneously, a total convergence of information that bypassed the usual process of evidence and reasoning and arrived already assembled. He was awake and certain before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark, before his mind had consciously catalogued what had woken him. The windows went orange. Not the orange of fire. He made that distinction immediately because fire was the referent the mind offered first, and he refused it on the evidence. Fire flickered. Fire moved in the rapid, chaotic way of combustion. Fire was accompanied by sound and smell that were entirely absent here. This orange was different. It was deep and steady, like light filtered through amber, like the glow of something that produced illumination as a byproduct of existence rather than of burning. It moved but slowly, and the movement was directional and purposeful, coming from the east, from the direction of the Ashvin Woods. He was dressed and at the clinic door before the light reached the field. The sound came next. He would spend a long time afterward trying to find adequate language for that sound because the language that existed for it was wrong in every direction. Roar was wrong, a roar was aggressive, percussive, an exhalation of threat. This was not that. It was a single note, low and sustained, resonating at a frequency that had less to do with the air than with the ground. A sound that seemed to arrive through the soles of his feet and the floor of his chest and the bones behind his ears simultaneously. It was the sound of something very old announcing its presence to the world, not as a warning, but as a statement the way a fact is stated, without argument or apology. The ground trembled, not violently, not the earthquake tremble of catastrophic force, but the trembling of something enormous simply moving across the earth, translating weight into vibration with each step. The instruments on his shelf chimed softly against each other. The water in the basin in the corner moved in small concentric rings. He lit the lantern, he opened the clinic door, he stepped outside. She filled the field. That was the simplest and most accurate description. She filled it. The field in front of the clinic was 40 yards across and perhaps 60 long, bounded on one side by the road and on the other 3 by low stone walls. It was a generous space. Elias had always thought of it as a generous space. One of the things he appreciated about this particular property, the sense of openness and air. Standing in the doorway looking at her, the field felt like a room. She was the color of iron that has been worked and worked and worked over centuries. Darkened, deepened, layered in tone the way old metal layers. A color that contained within it the memory of every temperature it had ever been and every force it had ever met. Her scales were enormous, each one larger than his hand, and they overlapped with a precision that suggested not accident but architecture, as though each scale had been placed with knowledge of all the others. Her wings were half spread, and the span of them, even partially open, even folded against their extension, crossed the field in a geometry that his eye refused at first to fully process. Her head was lowered toward the clinic door. Her eyes were the same amber as her child's. This should not have been surprising. It was heredity, it was biology, it was the most ordinary mechanism in the world operating in a creature that was not ordinary in any other respect. But it stopped him. The eyes were enormous, each one the size of a dinner plate, and they were lit from within with the same deep amber glow that had come through his windows. And they were looking at him with an intelligence so concentrated and so ancient that he felt it as a physical pressure. The way you feel the presence of a very large sound even before it becomes audible. He held up the lanterns. He stood in the doorway. He did not run. He had made this decision before she arrived, but standing in the fact of her, in the actual physical reality of her presence, which his imagination had prepared him for in the way that a map prepares you for a country, which is not very much at all, he understood that making the decision in the abstract was an entirely different thing from keeping it in the concrete. His body had opinions. His body was producing adrenaline in quantities that he could feel in his fingertips and his temples, and his body's recommendation was urgent and unambiguous and completely counterproductive. He overruled it with the same quiet authority he used to overrule everything his body recommended at inconvenient moments. He had 31 years of practice at that particular discipline. He stood still, he held up the lantern, he let her see his face. For a long moment, nothing moved except the breath coming from her nostrils. 2 great curling exhalations that caught the lamplight and rose into the dark air like the slow unfurling of something that had been folded for a long time. The field was silent in the way that large spaces fill with silence when something very large inhabits them, pressing all ordinary sounds to the margins. Then the clinic door pushed open against Elias' leg. The hatchling came through. It moved with the awkward, determined grace it had shown on the road 3 days ago, 3 limbs and careful wing, compensating without complaint, making the adjustment automatic. It walked out into the field and stopped between Elias and its mother, and it made a sound that he had not heard before, a series of low, falling notes that clicked and resonated in a rhythm too structured to be random, too complex to be simple vocalization. Language, some part of his mind said. That is language. She answered. The sound she made in response was layered. He could not have said how many notes comprised it, only that they were many, and that they interlocked with a precision that vibrated in his chest like harmonics from a struck string. The hatchling's ear membranes angled forward. It listened, all of its attention gathered to a point. Then it walked to her. It covered the distance between them in that three-limbed gait, and when it reached her it pressed its head against the foreclaw that she had lowered to the ground. A claw larger than the hatchling's entire body, laid flat in the field like a folded structure, and the sound it made then was very small and very low and entirely private. And Elias felt that he was witnessing something that was not for him and looked away for a moment. When he looked back, she was examining the wing. The delicacy with which she did it was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, would think of at strange and unexpected moments. In the middle of other things, the way certain images persist in the memory long after the event that produced them has receded. She lowered her great head, enormous as a cart, and she examined the splinted wing with her nostrils first, reading the dressing through smell, and then with the tip of a foreclaw, not the claw itself but the very tip, the point, used with a fineness of control that made no sense in anything so large and made complete sense in something so clearly intelligent. She touched the bandaging. She touched the joint. She moved around the hatchling's body, examining it from several angles, checking each limb in turn, reading the evidence of what had been done with the same systematic thoroughness that Elias himself used. She was assessing his work. He understood this. The understanding arrived without drama or surprise, simply clear. She was a mother and this was her child, and she was reading what had been done to her child with every sense available to her, and the quality of the reading was professional. He had the strange and not entirely comfortable feeling of having his work reviewed by a colleague. He stood still and let her review it. It took some time. She was thorough. When she was finished, she straightened, or rather, the part of her that was lowered raised itself back to the full height that had been blocking the stars on that side of the sky, and she looked at Elias. The amber eyes held him. He did not look away. He met her gaze the way he had met the gazes of patients who were frightened, patients who were angry, patients who were grief-stricken, patients who needed something from him that he was not certain he could provide. He met it steadily and without pretense, because pretense was not something he had ever been good at or seen the value of, and because whatever she was reading in his face, he wanted it to be accurate. For a long time they looked at each other across the dark field, and the lantern burned between them, and the valley was still. Then she exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, measured, controlled, carrying in it a quality that he could feel but not name. It smelled of deep earth and old stone and something that had no reference in anything he had smelled before, something mineral and ancient and entirely itself. The breath moved his hair. It moved the lantern flame, which bent and steadied. It was warm, far warmer than the autumn air, and the warmth was not uncomfortable but was present, deliberate. As though the breath itself was a communication in a language he did not speak but could feel. Then she dipped her head. Not a bow, he was clear on that distinction immediately, because a bow was a social performance, a gesture with an audience, and this had no quality of performance in it whatsoever. It was something more precise than a bow and more demanding than a bow, the way a signature is more demanding than a wave, a specific, committed act that costs something in its making. A dip of the head that carried in it the full weight of what had been done and what it meant and what she understood about both. He nodded back. He could not have said what else to do. He nodded the way he nodded when a patient said thank you, and he did not know how to answer thank you, which was always, because thank you was one of the words he could never quite receive gracefully. He nodded and he held the lantern and he stood in the field in the cold autumn dark and watched her take her child back into the Ashfin woods. The orange light moved between the trees and diminished slowly, the way the sun diminishes, with the same quality of taking a long time to truly go. He stood in the field until it was gone completely, until the woods were dark again and the stars had returned to the part of the sky she had been covering, until the ground was still under his feet and the night was nothing but night again. He stood there for a while after that too. The lantern burned. The valley was quiet. Somewhere in the dark field something small moved through the grass, and an owl called once from the direction of the old barn, and the frost was forming on the stone walls in the cold, clear air. He went inside. He sat in the kitchen. He did not make tea. He simply sat in Margaret's chair by the window, the first time in 8 years he had sat in it, and he looked out at the dark field and the dark woods beyond, and he breathed. After a while, he noticed that his hands were steady. He was, on reflection, glad about that. It seemed important. Whatever he felt about what had just happened, and he felt a great deal, layered and complex and not entirely sorted, not yet, his hands were the instrument of his work, and they were steady, and that was the ground from which everything else proceeded. He sat in Margaret's chair until it was nearly dawn, and then he went to bed, and he slept without dreaming, deeply and completely, for the first time in a very long time. Outside, the Ashfin woods were quiet. But in the morning, something would be waiting in the field. He almost missed them in the early light. That was the detail that stayed with him afterward, the small embarrassing almost, that he had walked to the kitchen window with his mind still half submerged in the deep, dreamless sleep of the night before. filled the kettle from the pitcher, set it on the stove, and stood looking out at the field for a full 30 seconds before his eyes adjusted to what they were seeing, and his mind caught up to what his eyes were reporting. The morning was still, the kind of still that only existed in the Ashfin Valley on certain autumn mornings, when the air had not yet decided to move, and the frost held everything in a suspension that felt almost reverential, as though the world were briefly observing a moment of silence for something it could not name. The field was white with it, a thin, even coating of frost that turned the grass silver and made the stone walls luminous in the early light, and against that silver and white, arranged in a rough arc before the clinic door, 7 objects sat on flat stones and caught the first pale suggestion of sunrise like altarpieces in a very old church. Elias stood at the window with the kettle in his hand and looked at them. Then he set the kettle down, put on his coat and boots, and went outside. The cold met him at the door, immediate, decisive, the cold of a morning that had committed fully to its temperature and had no interest in negotiating. His breath fogged before him. The frost crackled faintly under his boots as he crossed the path and stepped into the field, and the sound of it was the only sound in the world for a moment, that soft, crystalline protest of frozen things disturbed. He walked slowly. He had learned over 31 years of medicine that there was a quality of attention that could only be achieved slowly, that the careful observer moved at the pace of the thing being observed, not faster, because speed was a form of imposition, a way of projecting your own timeline onto something that had its own. He had applied this principle to patients, to wounds, to difficult diagnoses. He applied it now to 7 objects on flat stones in a frost-covered field, and he moved among them with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes open, and his mind in the receptive state he thought of as clinical quiet, that particular clearing of interior noise that allowed incoming information to arrive without being immediately classified and dismissed. He did not touch anything yet, he simply looked. The objects were arranged with intentionality so clear it was almost architectural. Not in a line, not scattered randomly, but in a careful arc that curved gently inward, as though the arrangement itself were a kind of embrace, or perhaps a kind of sentence, punctuated by space and sequence. Each rested on a flat stone that had not been in the field the day before, smooth, dark stones of a type he did not recognize from the local geology, brought from somewhere deeper in the Ashfin woods or further still, placed precisely level on the frosted ground. Each object rested exactly centered on its stone, and the spacing between them was even, and the whole arrangement faced the clinic door with the composed intentionality of a statement. She had taken her time with this. He stood in the arc and turned slowly, looking at each in sequence, and what he felt was not the excitement of discovery, though there was some of that running beneath everything like a current, but something quieter and more complex. The feeling of standing at the edge of a depth whose bottom he could not see. The feeling of being addressed in a language he did not speak but could feel the shape of, the way you can feel the shape of music you have never heard before you understand it. He crouched beside the first object. The surgical instrument was bronze. That was his first assessment, visual and immediate, the color and patina of worked bronze, the specific greenish-brown darkening at the seams and edges that bronze accumulates over time the way a face accumulates lines, not as damage but as record. It was approximately the length of his hand from wrist to fingertip, and its design was unlike anything in his catalog of instruments, either owned or studied. The handle was smooth and slightly flared at the base, shaped to rest between specific fingers in a grip that his hand found instinctively before his mind had consciously decided to pick it up. And when he did pick it up, that was the thing that he would come back to again and again in the years that followed, the balance of it. He had held a great many instruments in 31 years. He understood balance in a surgical tool the way a musician understands pitch, not as an abstract quality but as a physical fact, felt in the hand, in the tendons of the wrist, in the particular relationship between effort and result that a well-made tool establishes with the person using it. Balance in an instrument was not decoration. It was function expressed as sensation, the difference between a tool that required management and a tool that became an extension of the hand so completely that the hand forgot it was holding anything at all. This instrument had balance of a quality he had never encountered before. He turned it in his hand. He held it in the grip it suggested and made the small, controlled movements that the grip implied. And the movements were right, exactly right, the tool moving with him rather than requiring him to move around it, and he could feel even in that cold morning air, even without knowing what the instrument was designed to do, that it would do it with a precision that his best instruments approached but did not reach. He set it down carefully on its stone and stood, and his hand felt the absence of it. The clay tablet was the size of his palm and perhaps twice the thickness, fired to a warm terracotta that the frost had not dulled. He could feel, even before he examined it closely, that it was very old. There was a quality to old fired clay that he recognized from the fragments that turned up occasionally when the valley farmers dug deep, a density and specificity of surface texture that newer ceramics did not have. The characters pressed into its surface were arranged in careful rows, the impressions clean and deliberate, each one distinct. He could read none of them. He recognized none of the characters as belonging to any script he had encountered in his medical texts, his history books, the old documents he had occasionally seen in the hands of scholars who passed through the valley. He held the tablet and looked at it for a long time in the growing light, and he thought about what it might say. A medical text some quiet instinct offered. He could not have explained the instinct. It was not a reasoned conclusion but a felt one, the kind of knowing that arrived before its evidence that his years of practice had taught him not to dismiss. The arrangement of the characters had a quality that reminded him, in some way he could not articulate, of the arrangement of information in his own notes. Systematic, hierarchical, the organization of knowledge that needed to be retrieved accurately and in order. He would spend 6 months finding a scholar who could tell him he was right. The vial was sealed with something dark and waxy that had not cracked despite however many years or decades or centuries it had been in place. The glass, if it was glass, and he was not entirely certain it was, because no glass he had ever seen had precisely that quality of thickness and slight internal texture, was the color of very old honey, amber gold, and what was inside it caught the early light in a way that made it seem less like a liquid and more like something that had decided to behave like a liquid for convenience. It glowed faintly, not metaphorically, not in the loose, poetic way that beautiful things are sometimes said to glow. It actually produced light, a soft and steady internal luminescence that pulsed very slowly, very slightly, with a rhythm he found himself tracking before he realized he was tracking it. He did not open it. He would not open it for 4 months, not until he had thought carefully about what he would do with the information he might find inside, and not until a situation presented itself that made not opening it unconscionable. When he eventually had it analyzed, through a process that required 3 chemists, 2 botanists, and a long correspondence with a university in the capital, the results would come back in the form of a letter that began with the words "We are not certain what we are looking at," and ended with a description of wound-healing properties that current medicine could not replicate and could barely explain. He set the vial gently back on its stone and straightened, and for a moment he simply stood in the arc of objects in the frost-covered field, looking at what remained. The compass did not point north. He discovered this not immediately but within the first minute of holding it, a disc of dark metal beautifully made, its needle suspended on a pivot of such sensitivity that it moved to the pressure of his breath. He oriented himself by the sunrise, which was beginning in earnest now, the sky going from pale to gold at the eastern edge, and he checked the needle against east, against west, against the direction of the road that ran north through the village. The needle did not track any of them. It rested at a steady angle pointing toward the southeast, and when he turned, testing it, the needle turned with him, not to compensate, not to continue pointing the same cardinal direction, but to continue pointing in the direction it had chosen, which did not correspond to any cardinal direction at all. He held very still and he thought. He turned again slowly. The needle adjusted, maintaining its angle persistent and calm. He pointed the compass toward the Ashfin woods and the needle held. He pointed it toward the road and the needle held. He crouched and aimed it at the ground and the needle swung markedly, deliberately, coming to rest pointing at the earth beneath his feet. He dug there later that afternoon, a foot down, and found a spring. A freshwater spring, clean and cold and extraordinarily clear that he had not known was on his property in 31 years of owning it. He capped it with stone and covered it against the frost and used it for the rest of his life, and it never ran low, not in any drought, and the water had a quality that his patients sometimes mentioned without being able to specify. That drinking it was good in a way that transcended hydration, that was mineral and vital and somehow complete. The lens was ground from a stone that was not in any catalog he could find, not in his medical texts, not in the natural history books in the village library, not in the correspondence he eventually conducted with 4 different universities across 3 countries. It was pale, nearly colorless, with a slight internal structure visible only at certain angles, a kind of layering, like the layering of sediment, as though the stone had been formed over a very long time from material that had accumulated slowly and with great patience. Ground to a precise optical curve, it fit into the wooden frame he eventually made for it, and served him thereafter as a magnifying glass of a quality that current lens-making could not approach, not more powerful than existing lenses, but clearer, with an absence of distortion so complete that looking through it felt less like looking through glass and more like looking through a particularly truthful kind of air. He used it to examine everything that subsequently required close examination. In time, he could not imagine having used anything else. The sealed jar was ceramic, small enough to hold in one hand, its lid fixed with the same dark wax as the vial. Inside, when he eventually opened it on a mild day in late spring, were seeds, perhaps 40 of them, dark and oval, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of seed a person might walk past without thought in any market in any town. He planted them in the kitchen garden in early summer, not knowing what he was planting, which felt like an act of faith that he was slightly embarrassed about and did not mention to anyone. They grew with a vigor that the other plants in the garden observed from a respectful distance, and what they became was a low-growing plant with dark green leaves and small pale flowers that he had never seen before and could not identify. When he eventually had the leaves analyzed and tested, a process requiring patience and a willingness to be thought eccentric by several colleagues, the results indicated analgesic properties comparable to his strongest preparations, achieved through a mechanism that the analyzing chemist described as elegant in a way that suggests the plant has been solving this problem for considerably longer than we have. He grew it every year after that, he saved seeds carefully, he gave seeds to other doctors. The scale he found last set slightly apart from the others at the end of the arc, and he understood immediately what it was: a single scale, larger than his palm, from the mother herself. The color of old iron in the shade, it shifted at the edges toward something that had no name, a color that existed at the boundary between visible and not, that his eye could approach but not quite fix. It was warm in his hand. Not the warmth of something recently heated, but a persistent self-generating warmth, as though whatever had produced it was still, in some attenuated way, producing it, a warmth that did not diminish with time, that was there in January as it had been in October, that was there in the morning and in the night, steady and undimming as a conviction. He stood in the field with it in his hand, and the morning had fully arrived now, the sun clearing the eastern ridge and sending long gold light across the frosted grass, and the 7 objects on their 7 stones caught the light and held it each in their own way, and the Ashfin woods stood dark and enormous at the valley's edge, the way they had always stood, the way they had stood before the village was built and would stand after it was gone. He thought about what she had done. She had come in the night after her child was safe. She had come back not to retrieve anything, not to threaten, not to observe. She had come back to this field with these objects, and she had arranged them with care, and she had placed them before his door, and she had gone again before he could see her do it, and he understood that the not seeing was deliberate, that she had arranged it so he would find them in the morning alone in the ordinary light of day, without the complicating presence of herself. That the gift was meant to be received privately, without audience, without the distortion that her presence introduced. This consideration undid him slightly. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, and his undoing when it occurred was always quiet. But he stood in the field holding the scale with the morning light on his face, and he felt it, the full weight of what had happened over 3 days and 3 nights, pressing down on him gently but completely, the way a very heavy thing presses down when it is set down slowly rather than dropped. She had understood exactly what he was. Not a threat avoided, not a curiosity observed, not a human managed from the necessary distance of difference. She had understood that he was a doctor not just in the occupational sense but in the essential sense, in the sense of what organizing principle a life could be built around, and she had responded to that understanding with these objects, which were not random tribute but specific provision. Instruments, knowledge, materials, tools for the work. She had given him what a doctor needed. He cataloged everything that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh notebook and a pen, writing in the precise and methodical hand he used for patient records. He described each object, dimensions, materials as best he could identify them, physical properties observed, questions raised. He did this because documentation was the beginning of understanding, and because 31 years of medicine had taught him that the things you did not write down had a way of becoming the things you could not later prove. The village talked, he had known it would. Barrett Home had seen the hatchling on the road, and Aldrich Hess's wife had seen the orange light from her bedroom window on the 3rd night, and Merritt Falson, who had been to the clinic twice that week and had noted with her formidable observational capacity that he had received no one through the clinic entrance. Merritt Falson had seen him crouching in the field that morning, picking up objects from flat stones, and had told her daughter, who had told everyone. The versions proliferated and multiplied with the creative energy that rumors always developed in small communities. Some said he had made a pact, some said he was cursed. Some said the dragons had marked him, which was said sometimes with fear and sometimes with a reverence that made him uncomfortable in a different way. He corrected nothing. He explained nothing. He continued doing his work, which was the only correction he had ever trusted. What he noticed over the months and years that followed was that the Ashfin Valley became gradually a safer place. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be attributed to any single cause, but the wolves that had occasionally come down from the northern ridges in hard winters and taken livestock, they stopped coming. The strange sicknesses that had periodically moved through the valley from the direction of the deep woods, fevers of an origin he had never satisfactorily identified, the kind that came in wet years when people strayed too far from the roads they stopped coming to. The woods at the valley's edge seemed to the people who spent time near them to have changed in some quality that they could feel but not name, not less wild, not less deep, but different in intention somehow. As though something in those woods had made a decision about this valley and the people in it, and had communicated that decision to everything else that lived there. At dusk sometimes a shape moved between the trees. Irondark and vast and unhurried, visible for a moment in the gap between two oaks, or briefly against the sky at the tree line's edge before the dark took it back. The children of the village, who had initially been kept inside by parents understandably cautious about vast things moving at the forest's edge, eventually began to watch for it the way they watched for the first swallow of spring, as a marker, a reassurance, a sign that the world was ordered in a way they could trust. Elias saw it most evenings when he walked the field before bed. He had always taken an evening walk. Margaret had established the habit and he had kept it after her, one of the domestic rituals he maintained because some things were worth maintaining regardless of who was there to share them. He walked the field and looked at the woods, and the woods looked back, and that exchange had a quality he could not fully articulate but which had become, over time, something he depended on. He kept the scale on his desk. He had known immediately, holding it that first morning in the frosted field, that it belonged there, not displayed, not locked away, not catalogued with the other objects, but simply present in the place where he did his thinking, in the center of the ordinary working surface of his professional life. He could not have given a rigorous justification for this placement. He gave it the justification it deserved, which was none, because some decisions were not of the type that required justification and were only confused by it. It was always warm. Through the winter, when the clinic was cold, in the mornings before the fire caught, the scale was warm. Through the night, when the desk stood in the dark and everything else in the room was cold to the touch, the scale was warm. He did not know what that meant in any scientific or precise sense, and he spent a certain amount of time in the early years trying to determine it before he made a decision, conscious, deliberate, arrived at after genuine consideration, to stop trying. Some things were not made to be explained, they were made to be known. He touched the scale on the difficult nights. He would be sitting at the desk with a patient's file in front of him, a case that resisted him, a diagnosis he could not make with confidence, a decision about treatment where both options carried risk and neither carried certainty, and he would rest his hand on the scale and feel the warmth of it against his palm, and he would think more clearly afterward. He told himself this was psychological. He told himself that the warmth was simply a tactile anchor, something to fix attention, the medical equivalent of counting to 10 before speaking. He told himself this, and it may have been true, and it may not have been true, and the distinction, in the end, mattered less than the result. The result was that he thought more clearly afterward. The bronze instrument he used every day for 30 years, until the tremor in his right hand that began in his late 70s made fine work impossible. He set his last fracture with it. He sutured his last laceration with it. When his hands finally ended that part of his work, he placed the instrument in the center of his instrument shelf. His instruments retired to storage, but this one remained, and he looked at it each morning the way he looked at the scale on his desk and the old clock on the wall, as part of the ordinary landscape of a life that had been, on balance, a good one. The clay tablet he had translated, eventually, at significant expense, across significant time, through 3 scholars who each added something the others lacked, and the translation ran to 40 pages of dense, careful text that represented the most comprehensive document on non-human healing practices in any academic collection that existed. He donated the original tablet with its translation to the university library in the capital, with the condition that it be kept accessible to working doctors. The condition was honored, copies spread. Certain insights from the text, particularly those relating to fracture healing in high-stress skeletal structures and the management of membrane tissue repair, appeared in medical literature within 20 years, attributed vaguely to ancient sources, which was accurate enough. He kept the analgesic plant. He kept the compass. He kept the lens. He kept the warm vial on his desk beside the scale, the two of them companions in the particular category of things he had decided not to fully understand. He had learned that much, at least. 31 years of medicine had given him a great many things, but the hatchling in the rain and the mother in the field had given him something that practice alone could not produce, the knowledge carried in the body that the world was larger than the map of it, and that this was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be inhabited, with humility and with attention and with the willingness to stand in a doorway in the dark holding a lantern and let something ancient and enormous read your face. He had stood still. He had not runs. That was all it had been in the end, and it had been everything. An ordinary man doing an ordinary thing, staying present, helping what was in front of him, keeping his hands steady and his instruments clean and his door open. The Ashvin Woods remembered. 40 years after the night in the field when Elias Vorn died in the same house he had practiced in his whole life, Quietly in his sleep in the deep part of autumn when the first frosts came, the villagers said that something moved in the woods that night. Something vast and iron-dark standing at the tree line, visible for a long time against the sky. Just standing, looking toward the house. And then, when the night was very late and the stars had wheeled past their highest point and were beginning their long descent toward morning, it turned and went back into the dark of the Ashfin woods, and did not come to the tree line again for a very long time. But it did come eventually. It always came back.